Hello everybody, today we will be learning about the Renaissance. Just a brief introduction that gives you a basic idea of what this thing was and why it started. Here are the questions that you should be able to answer by the end of the video, and you should also be able to define the term secular. So what was the Renaissance? It was seen by contemporaries as a new historical age, different from the Middle Ages that had come before it. The literal translation of this, which is a French word, Renaissance, is in English, rebirth. And this is what people during the time period called this new historical age. They called it the rebirth because they viewed it as a time period where ancient Greek and Roman ideas were being revived after a long period thought of as the Dark Ages. And in historical terms, the Renaissance can be viewed as a period of accelerating cultural change. Things like education and science and technology and art all take off at this point and start changing and developing much more quickly than they had during the Middle Ages. It lasts from around 1350 to 1550, and the changes that occur during the Renaissance lay the foundation, the artistic, the intellectual, and the political foundation for the modern world. The Renaissance begins in Italy at the end of the late Middle Ages, and it spreads north over the next 200 years from Italy and influences European culture greatly. To get a better idea of the Renaissance, let's contrast it to the Middle Ages. So in the Middle Ages, you had a society that was almost entirely rural and whose economy was almost 100% agricultural. The Renaissance begins to shift away from this. In the Renaissance, society was increasingly urban, and there was an increasing emphasis on trade and manufacturing. So there's a shift away from the super rural society of the Middle Ages with an increasing focus on the city. Another change was the shift away from the community and tradition to an emphasis on the individual and on innovation. In the Middle Ages, you basically did whatever you were born into. So if you were born a blacksmith, you stayed a blacksmith. If you were born a knight, you stayed a knight. And you did whatever you were expected to do for the good of the community. In the Renaissance, there's a shift where the individual is more free to pursue his own potential. And if you're smart enough or creative enough, you could rise up in Renaissance culture. And there was also an emphasis on innovation. So rather than doing what people had done before you, if you could come up with new ways of doing things, or if you could innovate, you would be rewarded. Another important shift in the Middle Ages from the Middle Ages is that there is a shift away from a almost exclusive focus on religion and the afterlife to more secular concerns. In the Middle Ages, religion was of supreme importance, and we can tell this from all of the huge cathedrals and monasteries and crusades that we know happened in the Middle Ages. But in the Renaissance, all this stuff remains important. Religion remains very important, but there's a growing emphasis on the secular realm, that is, the non-religious parts of life. Linked to this is a change in what people study. Education shifts away from religious studies and to more practical subjects. So we see a shift away from theology and a shift towards subjects like math, science, language, and engineering. And last of all, we see a change in the pace of development. During the Middle Ages, there was progress being made in art and technology, but this progress was slow and gradual. In the Renaissance, this changes, and change becomes extremely rapid and revolutionary. And in 200 years, European society is transformed by the innovations that come about because of the Renaissance. Now that we have a basic idea of what the Renaissance was and how it was different from the Middle Ages, let us look at the causes of the Renaissance. So the Renaissance begins in Italy and spreads north from there. So if we want to understand why the Renaissance begins, we have to ask, why does it begin in Italy? And the answer has two main parts. The first is that Italy was an extremely urban area by medieval standards. And two, that Italy had greater contact than other parts of Europe with ancient Greek and Roman ideas. Let's start by talking about urbanization. So Italy, even in the Middle Ages, was a major trading hub, especially since the time of the Crusades, because, as you remember, Italian traders were primarily responsible for transporting people to the Holy Lands and for transporting good stuff like perfume and silk and spices from the Holy Lands back to Europe. So this gave the Italians an advantage when it came to trade. The Italian cities became rich and they were growing quickly, and they began to compete with each other on cultural projects. So basically each Italian city-state wanted to seem like it was the best, and so they would pay for artists and musicians and schools to be set up. That way they could claim to be greater than their rivals. This is why a lot of the really early Renaissance art gets made, to show the greatness of cities. And finally, in these cities, there's an increasing emphasis on education and individual talent. Out in the countryside, basically there's not many opportunities for upward mobility. If you're a farmer, you're a farmer, you're a knight, and that's it. But in a city, anybody can become anything. All you have to do is figure out a way to make money or to provide a valuable service to people. And so in the Italian cities, there's a break from old traditions and an emphasis on individual talent. This will become super important in the Renaissance. So the other thing that happens in Italy is there's greater contact with ancient Greek and Roman ideas. The first thing that leads to this greater amount of contact is that the Italians have been, since the fall of Rome, surrounded by the ruins of ancient Rome. And this is a constant reminder to the Italians of a glorious but vanished past that they think maybe they could regain someday. Also, the Crusades, which the Italians played a leading role in, led to the reintroduction of ancient philosophy and science to the Italian peninsula. Because while Europe was going through the Middle Ages, the Arab countries in the Middle East were undergoing a cultural golden age, and they were preserving ancient Greek and Roman ideas there. So after the Crusades, Europe gets all those ideas back, especially Italy. And finally, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 causes a huge flood of Greek texts and Greek scholars to flee from Constantinople to Italy. And so this gives a whole bunch of new material to Italian scholars who are already becoming very interested in classical ideas. And basically these two combined lead to the reintroduction of powerful ancient ideas into a dynamic and innovative society. The people in this society in Italy latch onto these ideas and run with them. The result of this is the Renaissance, which we'll be talking about for the next 4 or 5 days. That's all. Thanks for listening. See you later.